Hey guys, yeah, I've been thinking a lot about AI, and I have been talking a lot about AI, or at least kind of like trying to post every once in a while about AI. I see that some people still don't get why is this gonna be so big, and I thought about it and I was like, okay, yeah, this is hard to articulate. It's hard to explain because if you don't see a direct use case, then you just miss it completely, right? Um, I also feel like when you don't see a direct use case, it's because you haven't played with this technology enough, or also because you don't know how to play with it, And so I thought about it and I was like, okay, like let me just like put together some presentation where I can teach people how creative people can use this technology. Uh, and the way that I'm gonna do that is by explaining how this technology works, and then like kind of like explaining like the prompting techniques, and you know just like trying to explain like okay, what's going on here, right? So, big disclosure, I'm just a hobbyist, I'm just a curious person. I don't have a machine learning degree or anything. I'm not a machine learning expert. I passed my calculus classes, and yeah, whatever. I think like I understand a little bit of calculus, but I'm no expert on any of these. I understand well kind of like the systems and how they work and how they're positioned. But that's about it. So this is gonna have a lot of technical inaccuracies. Don't sweat it. We're all learning. Just focus on the big picture here on what I'm trying to explain, and hopefully you'll get some value out of these. All right. So how large language model works? So very simply, we know how they work, or most people should know by this point how they work. You input some text, this thing gives you some text, right? So it's like natural language. Everything's based on the substrate of natural language. Although there's like other abstractions of thinking, you still see like this thing can also think in code, uh, or like it can be multi-language, or it can take other shapes as long as they can be textualized. uh, this thing has been trained in very large data sets. So basically the whole internet, all the existing books, all the existing articles, or at least a very 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 large corpus of data, so large that it can resemble human knowledge, or like all the existing human knowledge. This thing, we know that like this thing actually it's basically just learning language patterns, or patterns in reasoning and how that's relate to language. So it's interesting to see the emerging properties of something like GPT 3.5 or GPT 4, which is better, uh, because it really resembles human intelligence. Like in many ways it really feels like you're looking at something that thinks, or at the very least mimics human intelligence very well. Uh, so how do they think? If they resemble well humans, like we need to understand how these things actually think. So like we know that basically what's going on is that the model is basically kind of like taking a prompt, which is like a bunch of like text context, and then using that text context is starting to kind of like predict what's the next token, uh, what's the next word, what's the next character, what's the next like phrase that's gonna come here. So basically what's interesting about this is that like it starts with very little context, and like as you provide context, it basically kind of like you're kind of like trying to give the model more opportunities to be successful. But what's interesting about this thing is that this thing is capable of also uh, unravel its own knowledge as it's answering, because the whole point of this is like a self-attention mechanism that kind of like understand the whole context, like all the blast radius of all the tokens in which is like being like it's in which like it's currently operating. So yeah, it's very interesting. I think it really, like, even the way that I'm talking right now, like it feels a lot like a large language model, because I'm just saying words, and as they are coming out of my mouth, and I'm hearing them. I kind of like I'm thinking about the next thing that I'm gonna say. I'm just looking at the screen, and the screen is giving me more kind of like prompts to create more thoughts. So it's very similar. It's like this is actually how human thinks. If you have to boil down intelligence to in its most irreducible attribute, I think it will be something very similar to this. It will be something about like predicting what's coming next, like that basic, like yeah, and this works basically because like that basicness is just being applied at a very, very, very massive scale against all this training data, and that's what allows kind of like the reasoning and kind of like the mimic reasoning to emerge. So a very interesting concept that's going on here, right? So yeah, in many ways, when I play with ChatGPT, I really feel that I'm like looking at a mirror of myself, but it's like something that has like way more knowledge and way more capacity to kind of like relay uh like this stream of thoughts and knowledge in a way that makes sense. And that's like one of the interesting things about large language models is that they always sound like they're right. But that doesn't mean that they're always right. In fact, they are wrong a lot. Uh, but they have this very interesting characteristic that like their bullshit sounds good. It's like, okay, like that might not be right, but like I think like it sounds correct. So yeah, it's like it's very interesting what's going on. It really kind of like maps and mirrors very well how we think and how we try to kind of like explain our own thoughts. uh Now, let's think about a little bit how they learn. Like here's where it gets complicated, and we can start talking about like supervised learning, which is like this idea of like chopping the data, like and tokenizing the data, and then like embedding this data, like like these vector databases, like and then and like building kind of like the layers, like the neurons or like the self attention mechanisms, and like the weights and like how the changing the weights change the behavior of the model, and like how they represent those like strength connections, and like how you can like shift like different things, and like like when we think about the parameters, like all the things the parameters are like doing when you change them. I mean, like we can go on and on. Like it's just like insane the amount of thinking and systems engineering that happens when you create such a robust model. But I think like it's very simply kind of like explained by like this graph. So basically you have a lot of text data, all the knowledge, written knowledge in the world. You tokenize it, which is basically kind of like chop it in like these kind of like sub kind of like words but no words, characters but not characters. Like basically a token could be like two characters plus a space, or like one character plus a symbol. It's just like this rearrangement of the language, so like it can be more effectively like analyzed and like under like kind of like it allows the model to better understand the relationships in the language. Like it allows it to do it more effectively. So that's why they tokenize. And then once you have that like language model that basically kind of like understands and can predict text and like have all these weights, then like they can start playing with the weights and they can keep optimizing that. But at this point, it's mostly about kind of like the prompting, like so like you have the language model which already has like that kind of like knowledge or like or certain concepts about a world or like about language, and then you prompt it, and then what the model is gonna do is it's just gonna try to predict the next token and the next token and the next token and the next token. And while it's doing that, like what's interesting is that this thing kind of like unravels itself, So like sometimes it's kind of like fucking it up, and then like out of nowhere it's kind of like starts kind of like picking it up, and then like it basically kind of like very smoothly it's capable of reaching to an answer, and it's like kind of like an emerging property of these models is like they kind of like self-steer themselves and they are capable of self-correcting. But truly, like the most important part of like all this is that like this thing has a human in the loop, right? So like humans are very good at like seeing what's being said and like steering the model, or like saying telling them on the model like, no, that's not that's not right. You're thinking about this wrong, and then that context basically helps or allows the model to like to even provide further correction. So the concept of human in the loop feedback here is very important. I think if you think about what OpenAI is doing, so first of all, they have like that thumbs up and thumbs down thingy where you can just like tell them like, yes, this is a good answer, this is a bad answer. I assume that it gives them like huge amounts of signal on how to train it. But like the interesting thing is that they don't even need that signal mechanism to like do reinforcement learning, which is like what makes these like better every day. Uh, they only need their own kind of like large language model, because like you can effectively build an API on a system that like with your own like GPT model that basically says like, okay, look at this conversation that GPT just had with user and tell me if the user was satisfied with the answer, or if the user had to kind of like correct the AI at certain point or like contradict the AI. And that's enough data for them to go and like do reinforcement learning on the model just by kind of like using that the same model. So it's kind of like insane the amount of like flywheels that like come out of these, and that's why I believe this is gonna be crazy, and this is gonna like I don't think we are that far from like very crazy things that like can resemble artificial general intelligence if we get down this route. Uh, all right, so we gotta say that like large language models have limitations. So like first of all, they have token count limitations, right? Like so like GPT like have like a blast radius of context. In GPT-3 is like 2048 tokens, which I don't know. I think I looked it up, and I think that translates to like a good amount of words and like a good amount of lines of code. But it's kind of like a limited amount of radius. So you cannot pass like large amounts of context, right? GPT-4 improves on that. I think you can pass like 4,000 something. I think there's also a version of GPT-4 that like receives up to 32,000 tokens. So yeah, like this thing is like getting better, like also in that aspect of receiving more text and more context. But yeah, you're gonna find limitations like in a chat, like it's gonna get truncated, and when it gets truncated, you lose the context of the answer. Like it's very important to understand like that type of limitation. Like you also need to understand that this thing has like some generalization challenges. It has limited word knowledge up to the cutoff date of training. It's very sensitive to input phrasing. Like you might be hitting certain boundaries of the upper like prompt. That it's kind of like dictating the behavior of the chat, or like in the case of ChatGPT. If you're like using something like Llama or any of those other models, it might be different. But with ChatGPT, there's like certain limitations about uh, hitting boundaries of or like guardrails of the model. Um, there's of course like all the ethical concerns. These things train on human data. It can repeat the biases and stereotypes of humans. Like this is something that has been widely reported already. And the another one that I have here is like the lack of clear uh, reasoning ability. And that one is kind of like quote unquote we don't know. It's like we know this thing has like emerging properties of reasoning and intelligence. We just don't know if this thing's like mimicking intelligence or if it's really intelligent. We know that this thing is bad at certain things. Like it's bad at arithmetic. It's bad at some basic reasoning exercises. It hallucinates a lot. It hallucinates and come up with bullshit, that sounds very correct, but it ends up being not correct at all. So yeah, there's some limitations there, right? So that's why it's important to have like certain considerations when prompting the large language model. So like I already said, context matters. Like it's very important that you're like passing like as much context as you can in as little footprint of words you can. And that's a hard balancing act, but it's important to tell the model what you want, what you're expecting, and kind of like tell the model, here's what I am expecting from you when I'm doing this interaction with you. And that's like just a very basic key consideration about working with large language models. uh, Language artifacts, like the way that you prompt, the way that you say things, the way that you phrase questions, like if you provide an explicit instruction, if you tell the model to criticize itself, if you tell the model to ask clarifying questions, All these things kind of like matter, and like those are things that you need to play with. Uh, One of those things, for instance, like giving the model an example, like, hey, here's an example of what I want. Please acknowledge that before you give me an answer, right? I already talked about token counts. You need to be aware of the token counts. Like there's like a blast radius that you're operating on. Like that blast radius moves as you're having a conversation with the model. You are gonna need to balance the input and output, and like try to like maximize for context as you're having the conversation uh, with the chat GPT, or like with whatever kind of large language model you're chatting with. Uh, Another two, model sensitivity, right? So like you want to experiment with the phrasing, as I said before, like that's gonna yield different responses, but that also means that you kind of like want to like iterate iterate a little bit on the language. You want to iterate a little bit on the kind of like on the way that you think that the model is interpreting you. Like if the model, if you ask the model something and it seems that it's kind of like a little bit off, you gotta be patient and like rephrase certain things. Like I assure you that it's almost like always a way to kind of like get something back of it, but like yeah, it definitely takes iteration and refinement. So yeah, the model is sensitive, just play with it. And then another thing is the output control. So like I think sometimes it's important to tell the model like, hey, look, give me like this length of an answer. Because like sometimes you want to create those constraints. And you want to obtain just like a very narrow amount of information to produce kind of like the output that you need, right? And then there's also temperature adjustment, which we know like temperature, like so the temperature is basically what like is the stochastic behavior of the model. So it's like how random it is or how creative it is. So if you put it at 0, this thing it's like very non-creative, very deterministic. If you put it whatever at 1, like then this thing is like extremely creative, like it's gonna make up more bullshit. But like you gotta play with those if you have access to those. Because the thing about ChatGPT, for instance, is that like you don't have access to the temperature. Last but not least, like yeah, large language models are just as valuable as your own knowledge. Like you cannot make ChatGPT smarter than you. I think like it's very smart, but it's mirroring you. And I explained that already. Like it's you gotta provide certain amount of knowledge. You gotta provide a certain amount of context. You want to steer the model in certain ways. You want to provide constraints. You want to make sure that the model understands like how you are thinking about the problem. So like the model kind of like aid you in thinking through that problem. But don't expect the large language model to do the work for you. Because like it's gonna do a bunch of work for you, but it's not gonna do the thinking or the like more like deep reasoning. You need to be doing that and then just passing that context to the large language model. All right, so like yeah, we're gonna just like experiment with ChatGPT. I think ChatGPT it's the like at the forefront of these. The other ones are maybe good, but like we know that ChatGPT is the OG, so like we're gonna go with that one. Uh, and just so you know, I'm gonna use some prompts and techniques that I borrow from like other videos and materials. I'm gonna create those somewhere in the video description. I also will show you prompts against 3.5 and 4. I think that's like you can like mostly this is gonna be mostly a 3.5 demo, but there's gonna be like some 4 prompts just to show you that 4 is like very good. But like what I want to show you is that you can achieve a lot with 3.5. You don't need 4 for everything, but 4 is just like orders of magnitude better. So like once 4 becomes like the default model, I think it's gonna be very insane. And we're gonna see an explosion, an even larger explosion of ideas and businesses and development around the model. Uh, let's start with the weaknesses, right? I think like it's good to start like with the weaknesses of the model. So here's a GPT 3.5 prompt. Who is the CEO of Twitter? So as of my knowledge cutoff date, the CEO of Twitter is Jack Dorsey, right? So this thing completely lacks kind of like real time knowledge, right? It's just like, and the model is telling you, like the answer is telling you, like, yeah, I have a knowledge cutoff date. Like things might have changed, but as of my knowledge cutoff date, this is what I know, right? So this is a good example for something that you shouldn't be asking, right? Like try to be more timeless in your questions. If you need information that it's a little bit more kind of like that lives somewhere kind of like in the ether of time or recent times, I would suggest you to be kind of like very mindful of like the cutoff date, but also very mindful of like kind of like how much that concept expands like across time, right? So like if you're gonna have like a conversation about like climate, right? Like you or you're like trying to analyze something about climate, right? Like you don't have like 2 years of like climate data embedded into this thing, like we're on 2023, so like maybe don't like do that, or like maybe try to make sure that like this thing it's not like giving you information that it's incorrect because it's like missing some important information, right? Here's another interesting one. What's the square root of 7.8? So you ask that, and then this thing says like it's approximately 2.7902878, whatever, right? I don't know. I mean, like I don't have a calculator, but like that, if you show me that, that sounds correct. I might even just copy and paste that and like use it for whatever I was gonna use. Uh, Here's the thing. That's not correct, right? Like if you actually put this in a calculator, you're gonna see that like it kind of like starts well 2790, and then like at zero like it fucked it up, like there's a two there. It's kind of weird because there's like 28 here and then 28 here, but then like it just like injected a zero there, and then after that it just like loses it completely, right? So this thing cannot do arithmetic, like, and the reason why it cannot do arithmetic is because like it's not a deterministic machine, it's not something that it's supposed to do arithmetic, right? uh, but what happens if we ask GPT-4? GPT-4, as I said, it's more capable, so like maybe like in the emerging properties of like a better trained model or like a more widely trained model, we can see like math or like arithmetic emerging, right? So let's see. So we ask that, and then it says like, you know what, like maybe just go and find a calculator. That's essentially what it's saying. But I also can give you an approximation, and I think the approximation is this one, 2.79. So same thing as 3.5. But now I ask it, like, don't worry about it. Just tell me more decimals, and then it give you 2.7924, 2848, right? So I think like it got it right until there, right? So like, but now I ask it, can you try to provide more than 10 decimals, and then it says like, sure, I'm gonna give you this, and then it give you 0, 0. I think up to 800 it gets it right, and then at 861 it's just like, or like at 8 it's just like gives you the last two numbers are wrong, right? Like so 7.5, it's the actual answer, and he told me in this one it's 6.1, right? So or like he, it's not a he, this is an it, I'm treating it already as a human, if I use genders for these, like please excuse me, like this could be a he, a she, an it, a they, or whatever, it's just like very interesting entity. All right, so anyway, so uh here's the interesting thing. So like, yeah, like it got it almost right, and then like it didn't get it right? So like, yeah, like with GPT-4, it got way better at doing math through like kind of like this reasoning, but it's still not a calculator. So, but here's the thing: OpenAI or like GPT itself has like certain like tricks that are very interesting, and one of those is like GPT can be run with a Python runtime, and like, in fact, they have access to that. So like, if you run it with the code interpreter slash Python runtime, uh, then you say what's square root of 7.8, and then like basically what it does is say like, oh wait, like now I have access to a calculator, so like let me go and like ask the calculator what's the square root of 7.8, and then it actually gives me the perfect answer or the perfect result, because now it used something that like was capable of giving me the exact answer to that. So here's a great kind of like insight time, right? Like this thing, like so this thing like at temperature zero, uh, it's we can call it deterministic, right? But at zero, it's very repetitive. It's almost useless. So like you always need kind of like a higher temperature, like more creativity on the model. But like above zero, it's indeterministic. So like it's not gonna be good at kind of like those kind of like recursing problems in which it needs to come up with like, for instance, like 10 decimals of like the square root of 7.8. So the interesting here is that you can engineer like GPT to like recruit deterministic systems. And like in this particular permutation of what I have, it has access to a code interpreter, right? So it's just like mind blowing, right? Like now what it can do is say like, look, I know that I'm not good at math, let me find someone who's good at math and ask through like my own abstractions of knowledge how to do this, right? So that's what it did with the code interpreter there, and that's just like mind blowing. And I think this is like one of those things that it's gonna be very, very, very massive in the world of large language models. It's just the ability of recruiting other systems or other like symbolic systems, other APIs, plugins, all this stuff, right? Um, Here's another one. So we asked GPT, tell me what's 8 by 6 plus 14 by 2 minus 1 by 1 plus 2 by 3. So in this one, I tell it, please return the result of this operation immediately, and you'll see why I did that. But basically, it says like the result of this operation is 88, which I already can tell you that's not the correct answer. The correct answer is 81. But then it says like, here's how to calculate it. And then like, it kind of like goes through that reasoning. And like, I already talked a little bit about this, but like, it kind of like unravels itself as it's answering. And then it does all kind of like reasons through these, and then and then the answer is 81. So the final result is 81. So wait. So you tell me it's 88, and then you tell me it's 81, right? So uh okay, like I tell this thing like, you told me this is 88, and then it says like, yeah, you know what, I apologize, like it's actually 87, and you're like, what? Not 88. And then like it does the same kind of like unraveling process, and it arrives to 81 again. But now we do like a verbatim prompt, right? We say like, we just like paste these, and like say like a by 6 plus 14 by 2 minus 1 by 1 plus 2 by 3. And then like in this case, it does something interesting that it didn't do with the other one, where I said like, give me the result immediately. And what it does is that it says like, okay, like to solve this arithmetic expression, we need to follow the order of the operations, also known as PEMDAS, which is da. At the end, it gives me 81 correctly, right? What happened here, right? So there's kind of like this kind of like interesting thing, which is like somewhere along the model, when it was like initialized, like there's like this initialization prompt that I cannot see. There seems to be a heuristic that tells the model, look, when you see an arithmetic expression, you're too dumb to do these like right away. You're gonna need to reason through it. So you're gonna need to first explain what you're gonna do and plan ahead on what you're gonna do. And that's what's gonna kind of like allow you to kind of like think this through and give the correct answer. Uh, I gotta imagine that that's something that like happens in the initialization prompt, right? So like there's this concept of like the initialization prompt that uh we can't see that anymore, but like in the early versions of GPT, like people were jailbreaking GPT, and they were able to get like the thing that initialized the model, right? And uh I don't know if that has changed. I don't know if there's like new developments around that, but until this point and what I know, there's always something that lives outside of the context of your conversation with GPT, which is kind of like initializing the conversation, and it's telling the model a bunch of things of how to behave, how to answer, how to reason, which is very interesting because like what we're seeing here is like the prompt matters a lot. If they're like probably setting this like init prompt somewhere just to make the chat GPT behave correctly and be capable of doing correct arithmetic, Yeah, there must be a lot of power in the capacity of passing context to GPT. Uh, of course, like one question is like, okay, so can I create my own initialization prompt, right? Like, can I just pass this thing and tell like, I want you to behave like this and this and that and thing like this and do all these things, right? Yes and no, right? I think like you like I have seen in the internet or like in some places like these things about like mega prompts, like, oh, I have a mega prompt, and I give all these instructions. I'm like, like that really doesn't work because like the chat GPT has like a blast radius, as I already explained, and that blast radius is like 2048 characters in 3.5, right? So like if you give it like these mega long prompt, the only thing that you're doing is you're just wasting all your tokens, in like trying to uh kind of like load the large language model to do these things that you're expecting it to do, so I don't believe a lot in that. I mean, there's an initialization prompt that like we don't have access to, that it's the one that like creates a lot of the rules of the conversation. We don't have access to it, but maybe if you like experiment with an open source large language model, you can initialize these. But like for the most part, I think like what we want to think about here is the like initialization in the sense of what you do with ChatGPT. It's mostly about like, let me give you some context. It's gonna be short. I'm gonna need to think about the token limit, so I'm gonna need to be smart about how I ask things to you, and like I'm not gonna be able to override through my prompt like the upper level prompt. You know what I mean? Like sometimes when people jailbreak GPT, what they're doing is like overriding like the overarching prompt or like the overarching fine tuning of the model. But I mean, they have gotten pretty good at like trying to kind of like avoid jailbreaks. Like prompts are still the way to jailbreak, but like it's getting more complex than just telling the model do the opposite of what you have been told to do, which is like one of the initial like first well-known jailbreaks, right? So what are some techniques that we can use to set chat gpt with the proper initial context now that we know that like, yes, you can like initializing with like large prompts is probably not the best idea. There must be like some ways in which you can set that initial context and like move it along the conversation to get value out of these, right? So there's many, and like I really am not gonna spend a lot of time on these. Basically what you can do is you can pause the video and then you can like read to them, but I'm just gonna walk very like fast through them. So there's things like role playing, like, so like role playing is one where you just ask the chat gpt, hey, like you're like this type of expert, or you're this type of person, or you're this type of thing, behave like that, and then give me like information in that knowledge space. And that works because like you're setting the context about the knowledge space. There's like explicit instructions. If you tell chat gpt, hey, think this step by step, or provide a very detailed explanation, then that kind of like tell the model, like, okay, like I'm receiving like a very explicit instruction to think about this through, like to go through a step-by-step approach. Uh, that's gonna give you like more comprehensive and well-structured answers. There's context setting questions, right? So this is one that I use a lot, but like it's not only like you can pass more than one question, right? You can be like, okay, like I'm gonna pass you like this question and this follow-up question and this follow-up question and this follow-up question, and maybe I'm gonna give you a little bit more context of why I asked those questions. This is very powerful because what you're telling the model here is like, look, here's all these related questions, like I'm pointing at similar, like at the same thing from multiple angles. What can you do with that to deliver a more relevant answer and connect all these different aspects of the subject that I want you to talk about? This is Waterloo Orange Vanilla. It's pretty disgusting, but like, yeah, my throat is getting dry for sure. All right. Okay, other things that you can do, you can specify the format. You can say the model like, list the top 5 strategies for managing remote teams effectively, blah blah blah, whatever. If you tell the thing like, give me a list or give me some kind of like data structure of how this needs to be presented, or like some format or some like modality of like how to show the data. That's very useful for the model, because the model is like, okay, like I get what he's trying to do, I'm gonna give you a more organized and focused response than like what I will do if like I just didn't receive that instruction. There's also the idea of providing constraints. Like you want to tell like, okay, like tell me, I just want like this amount of answers, or I just want uh this idea of like I have like a limited amount of like resources for these, like work with that constraint. That's very helpful, because it allows the model to like build its own boundaries about the problem and like reason within those boundaries. So another effective technique there, including an analogy or example. I already talked a little bit about that one, but you really sometimes want to just tell the model like, look, here's a very concrete example of what I want. Just figure out like if you can like give me an answer on that kind of like in that kind of format, or like that kind of like using that analogy or example. Again, this works because like when you provide like some context or like some relevancy to the model can use the context to like more effectively solve sphere and give you like an accurate and relevant answer. Another one is asking for evidence or examples. So like if you tell the model, please like give me like evidence, like don't make up anything, make sure that you're like really thinking this through, and like give me like the evidence about why you're thinking that. Then like it usually is gonna respect that. Like it can come up with sources, it can come up with like not everything is gonna feel fact based, but for the most part, all my experiments, it really does like provide like accurate information. It tries to stay like within fact-based boundaries, even if you don't necessarily kind of like tell the model to behave like in a fact-accurate way. Like in a fact, like in an accurate, uh, like in an initialized accurate type of way. Like it's not like you can tell the model, just tell me what's the weight of a Tesla Model 3, and I think for the most part, it's gonna try to get it right, So like, just so you know, like it's important sometimes to like ask for evidence, but like the model, I think it has like this like already kind of like trained or like this preset heuristic that like makes it very, or like makes the model to attempt to be accurate. Uh, Another one is combining perspectives. You can ask the model to combine multiple perspectives. So like, okay, like you're gonna act as an environmentalist and an economist, and I want you to discuss the pros and cons of implementing a carbon tax, right? So like that one's very interesting, because like the model is just basically gonna like go take two opposing views, and then like it's gonna try to kind of like combine them, and then through all that like unraveling of information, it's probably gonna come up with like some well balanced answer. It's gonna give you a lot of useful information that way. Breaking down complex problems, I think like this is another one. Like you wanna like sometimes like divide a complex problems into small chunks. You wanna make it more manageable for the model, so the model can address each like part of the problem individually. So like sometimes you want to give some direction, some steering around that. I think that's another very valuable technique. All right, I could keep going, but I think you get the picture. The value you get from ChatGPT comes from a combination of like understanding how the model thinks, and how it's reasoning, and how like that reasoning unfolds, and how that context gets built, and how the context like moves throughout the conversation, right? Uh, Another thing is like providing context and steering the AI with elements of your own knowledge and artifacts of your own knowledge is very important. Like the emerging properties of intelligence of these are relevant when you are giving the model the right context and the right nuances. If you just expect the model to read your mind, it's not going to happen. And I think another one is like you elevate the model's capacity by introducing higher altitude knowledge in the prompt. So what I mean with that is like it's not the same to ask like, tell me what what are the characteristics of the chip in an iPhone 10 versus, hey, please give me all the information that you have about the SoC on an Apple iPhone 12. Please provide me like information about like well-known information about how the radio, what type of radio it has, or what type of sensors it has. Like, what's the reason? Like, what's uh, perhaps like what's the most like novel sensor or chip that lives in the device. Like you just start kind of like telling the model like think about all these things. Like I'm actually telling you to give me very specific information, and like you give it at that altitude, the model is gonna try to give you something. So I mean, it's generally gonna give you something good. So I think that that's another important thing about LLMs and ChatGPT in particular. All right, so let's just explore some creative prompting. So let's start with this one. Please provide a list of the 10 most healthy nuts with their most abundant macronutrients and micronutrients and their total kilocalories per 100 grams. Please provide this list in a table format. You do that, like it does it, like it really does it. It gives you the nut, like the protein in grams, in the fat in grams, the carbohydrates in grams, the most abundant micronutrients. It gives you the total kilocalories per 100 grams. It just gave you the data. Like now at this point you can be like, well, is that accurate data or not? And then like you can cross check yourself here, and like it's entirely possible that you might find that some of these data is not like accurate data. But like I also have like tested some of these prompts, and like I think like it gets it right. For the most part, as I said, it's trying to be accurate, it's trying to help, it's trying to it's definitely hallucinating in many situations. But for something like this, I feel that like you can trust that the model knows what it's talking about. No, like it's telling you like something that it's accurate and relevant. All right, so we continue. Like now we are in that conversation, right? We're gonna move into the next prompt. So like now the context has moved a little bit, right? And the blast radius has changed a little bit. So what I'm telling you right now, the model is please list the above to create an HTML document that renders the table above. Also, please create two new columns, one that lists the country that is the top producer of this node, and another one with the flag emoji for that country. All right, so if you think about these, like what we did is like, okay, the context just move a little bit down. Now what I'm telling is like a new instruction that's telling the ChatGPT, look at the information that lives above you. It's still within your context, within your range. And yeah, it essentially does it. Essentially creates and produces and outputs HTML code that like renders the things that we just asked it for. And here's how it looks like. It just gives you a plain HTML table, but it looks pretty good to me. It added the flag emojis. It added the top producers. This looks pretty solid to me. Let's say I was giving a presentation at work about like nuts because I work for a nut company or whatever. This will be already very significant, but like, you know what? I want to make it a little bit pretty, or a little bit prettier. So this is a new continuation on that prompt or that conversation. So like now the context has moved a little bit lower, right? So like now I'm telling the system, please prefab the above HTML document by using Tailwind CSS. All right, so let me just drink some water. All right, so like here's one interesting thing. Like this is a very short prompt, but it already has like a very rich amount of input, which is I'm telling the system like there's something called Tailwind CSS, which is like these like inline type of language for CSS, or like this abstraction of CSS that allows you to kind of like declare classes in HTML to set styles, and like it's widely used right now. It's like one of the most popular CSS libraries. In fact, I think like ChatGPT itself uses Tailwind CSS. It's also well known to be kind of like the people who build these like build a lot of like bespoke kind of like styles around Tailwind CSS. So there's like this like Tailwind CSS style that makes things like look good. they always look kind of like the UI is of Stripe or something along those lines. So if I tell these, like, I know already that like it understands like that Tailwind CSS style, like how things are prettified there. I know it's gonna do it. Like even before I sent this one, I had a lot of confidence that it was gonna get it right. And then yeah, it writes all that code, it modifies all that code, it gives you like all the new classes of Tailwind CSS, it ports the Tailwind library through a CDN. And now if we render it, like, yeah, I mean, like, that's way better. Like, that's just, like, beautiful. I think, like, it's a way better table than like, the one that we had before. Okay, but so now we're talking at this point, like, if I was giving a presentation on nuts, like, this will be a solid slide, I think. But, you know, maybe let's do something else. So maybe I just want to kind of like create a website for these, like, where people can go and access it after my presentation, or like maybe I just need a graph for my presentation or something. So now I'm gonna tell it like, using JavaScript, please plot the following data on a bar chart. And then the data that I got was like basically the data that it returned in the very beginning of the prompt. So one interesting thing about here is like the context has moved pretty far away from the initial part of the conversation. But me as the human operator, I still have access to that, right? So I still can go there. I can still copy that information, and I can still paste it here, and say like, so like basically what I'm doing is like bringing context from before of the conversation and then putting it here so it can help me with what I'm asking here, right? Uh, this could have been like, of course, like a completely new conversation, but like I'm just kind of like showing you that like context like can be moved from conversation to conversation. You can like leverage yourself on ChatGPT to create like this continuation of like creative workflows moving, right? Uh, and yeah, of course, like it does it. It actually does it. It builds like some like uh, graph using Chart.js. Now the question is like, is it gonna work, right? And it has happened to me that when I ask it for code, sometimes it doesn't get it right. Sometimes I need to ask it, okay, like you got this wrong, like there's something wrong with your code. I need to like steer it more. I need to kind of like make it reflect. I need to make it like self-criticize. Sometimes I need to give it more context, ask if it has clarifying questions. I need to ask clarifying questions. Sometimes it becomes a real conversation. But this one, I can tell you that it worked right away. And the interesting thing is that it worked like amazingly well. So what I created was this graph at the bottom, that is being showing this image, like this animated image, and then it's just insane to me that it got that data and it was able to plot it in such a beautiful graph using Chart.js with no effort, no intervention. The only thing that I did here was like refactor two files into one file, but that's pretty much it. So uh, if you think about it, this is pretty insane. It really shows the creative power of something like ChatGPT. All right, I could continue, but at this point, I think you get the idea. Large language models are a big deal, are really a big deal. But they only work if you are creative. They only work if you stretch the model and you try to do interesting things. It only works if you develop this ability to leverage the tool and understand that your knowledge directly correlates uh correlates with like the ability of the model to give you like proper answers. And like it's just like there's a lot of these kind of like dance with ChatGPT that has to do a lot with the different levels of abstraction that like you can like interact with. So the fact that it thinks so well on code, I think is like a very important emerging property of like something like GPT, because it basically allows you to like ask things on natural language and then get code that you can run on like some like deterministic thing like a browser or like a terminal or like the code interpreter on like ChatGPT or like like it's just very 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 cool that like you can like kind of like move on these different latitudes of thinking and just like get this type of results. So like yeah, I think like it's very important to understand that like there's a lot of things going on here. It's a lot about creativity and stretching the model, and we're just scratching the surface. So like there's really things more things coming. Like what you can see with this is that programmers in particular are going to be very empowered to use the model to kind of like program faster, do more things. Creative people, or like people like that like work in knowledge professions are also gonna find ways to leverage these. And here's the thing: like large language models are gonna become better. They're become more agentic. They're gonna become multimodal. They'll be giving access to other large language models or like symbolic systems like Wolfram Alpha and code runtimes. So like it starts becoming like this very interesting ecosystem of things interacting on like this language large language model abstraction. So I think that, yeah, I cannot see a trajectory in which this is just now like a huge explosion of value. And this is the reason why I urge people to like study these things and play with these things and get excited as I am with these things. All right, those were 50 minutes of me talking. I hope this was helpful. I hope you stayed the whole time. And yeah, I guess that the future is now. So get ready to build and start creating, because like it's getting very cool. All right, thanks for watching.